here this morning. My father called me last night and sounds really good. He's got his high blood pressure down quite a bit. I guess he's on not quite double the medication he's been on. And my mom was saying this morning that they got it down so far that he's so weak he can hardly walk. So I don't know if it's the... you got to have some kind of oil pressure in there for the motor to work, don't you? Anyway, it's amazing what they can do, and I think, however, they're at the place where we have to depend on a great physician. So let's pray for it. If you have your Bibles this morning, I'm sure you do. If you don't have one, we've got a couple extras up here, or you can look off someone beside you. I'd like you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 15. Wes and I have been going through the Old Testament in one of our courses, and I've been enjoying the refresher course. David, the greatest king of the nation Israel in the Bible, is a fascinating character to study. This morning I'd like to talk about a few things that deal with David's life, because David was very much the opposite of his predecessor. Who was the first king of Israel? Saul. And who was the greatest king of Israel? Someone from the second row. That's debatable. David was probably the greatest king. All the other kings are compared to David, not Solomon. All right? And who was the richest and the wisest king of Israel? Solomon. Right? So that's the way to remember the first three kings of the nation. The first one was Saul. He's the first king. The greatest king was David, who was the second one. And the third king was the wisest and the richest. And from there it went all downhill. Well, you may have heard that David in the Bible is called the man after God's own heart. And that's what I'd like to reflect on this morning. This is somewhat of more a devotional thing than it is a teaching thing. I know that most of us are familiar with some of the stories in the Old Testament. I'd like to just direct your thoughts this morning to some of the statements about King David in the Old Testament, because they have a lot to teach us about our own self, help us with our day-to-day struggles. In fact, I spent an hour on the phone last night talking with a man that I believe is being put through something similar to what David was put through in his early life. And this morning I'd like to review that. We get so impatient with God. I think perhaps impatience has to be one of the worst virtues, or the worst vices, I guess is a better way to put it. Impatience has got to be one of the worst vices, because it prevents us from waiting on God. Impatience prompts us to respond in a fleshly way to the circumstances that God brings our way. We just get fed up with waiting, and we just dive right in and do it our way. That's because of impatience. Impatience prompts us to rebel against God. Impatience prompts us to be insubordinate. We get all fed up with God's way. We get fed up with having to listen to spiritual leaders that we think are just slowing us right down, or other people that we have to depend on, and it seems like they're going nowhere. They're like a great big block in front of our progress. So we tend to get really nasty, and we get angry with them, and we talk about them behind their back, and we got it in for them. That's because of impatience. Impatience nullifies faith. Faith, by its very nature, means depending consciously, steadfastly, day by day, just hanging in there and waiting on God. Now, impatience is the exact opposite. And ultimately, impatience thwarts victory. If you want to be defeated in your life, then don't allow God to develop patience in your experience. If you want to be defeated, then just go ahead and be a hotshot character. So impatience is one of those very prime things. And you know, I said a moment ago that David is one of the great characters in the Old Testament. He's called the man after God's own heart. The characteristic of this man's spiritual life ought to make us pant to be like that. It ought to make us so desirous of being like him that we just have a longing desire. As I said a few moments ago, too, for those of you just come in, if you compare Saul and David, they're quite opposite. Saul was an impatient character. He was fleshly, he was weak, he was unstable. Ultimately, he was rebellious against God. Ultimately, God picked him up by the ruff of the neck, as it were, and threw him out of the way, got rid of him, because of his lack of character. David was the exact opposite. And the story of David's development and his character and what God did in his life is recorded in the book of 1 Samuel. David was strong because he was spiritual, and he was spiritual because he was patient. He was willing to just wait and allow God to work things out. The worst thing in the minds of many people is just to wait. I hate waiting. Can't stand waiting. I don't want to wait. Let's get on with life. Young people think that having to wait for the right person to come along that has godly characteristics is the worst thing you could possibly. Let's get married. Or parents, or people that have gotten finished with their education. They just don't want to wait. They want to get into the workforce, liable to make dumb moves. And that's something we have to deal with every day. We get tired sometimes of waiting on God's way. Okay, enough preamble. Let's look at David's characteristics. Let's look at some of the things about David that made him a man after God's own heart. What was it that was so great about David? 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 28, gives us first reference to David in the Old Testament, I think. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Now let's get the picture. Lots of times when we read something in the Bible, it doesn't stand out as significant because we don't see the context. The context of the 15th chapter of 1 Samuel is that this was the watershed. This was the line that Saul crossed. This was the first chosen king of Israel. He was a tall man. He was well endowed. He was handsome looking. To look at him, he looked like Superman. Saul was quite the character. He was the people's choice. But this man ultimately took God's word, slammed it shut, and said, I can't handle it. I'm not going to do it this way. I'm not going to wait. And in the 15th chapter of 1 Samuel, what we have is a confrontation between God's prophet Samuel, who was in daily contact with God, and God brought this man over, and face to face with this king, he said, Saul, God has ripped the kingdom away from you. I'd like to just back up to verse 22 and 23. Samuel said to Saul, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. Isn't that something? God views stubbornness and rebellion just as sinful in his sight as being a Satan worshiper or occultic or whatever. In his books, he doesn't want you to do your own thing and then come back afterwards with a little pittance of a sacrifice and give him some money to try to appease your conscience. He doesn't want you to sacrifice things that you shouldn't have in the first place. He doesn't want you to rebel against him and do what you want and then try to do something nice afterwards. No. To obey is better than sacrifice. That's a all-pervasive principle in the Scripture. And this guy had it backwards. He was willfully going his way, and God just wouldn't take it. No way. And so he took the kingdom away from Saul and gave it to David. In verse 28, Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day and has given it to a neighbor of thine who is better than you." That's David. First mention of David in the Old Testament. He's called Saul's neighbor that's better than him. God knows who's who. He has his own book. He knows who you are. He knows what your life is like. He sees all. He knows all. And lest I bore you to death, I just wanted to say that. I don't want to elaborate on that, but the fact of the matter is that God had his finger on David. David was a young guy. In fact, Saul had a son that was about the same age as David at this time. Jonathan was just a young guy, young man. And these two guys became bosom buddies. And as we work our way through the next few chapters in 1 Samuel, you're going to see how different David was from Saul. In the next chapter, we have the account of Samuel being sent by God to David's hometown, which is about 10 miles south of where Saul was living, in a place called Gibeah. And Samuel is sent to Bethlehem. You know the story, how that David had 7 brothers. I think he had 7 brothers. There were 8 sons of Jesse. And he went through the whole list. He went to Bethlehem and he picked out the oldest and then the next oldest and on down the line. And David wasn't even home. He was out in the field looking after the sheep. He was the last one on the ladder. So he had to do the dirty work. All the brothers were at home, I imagine, doing what older brothers do. Verse 7, God instructs Samuel, "Do not look at this man's countenance, the height of his stature, because I have refused him. The Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." So God wasn't interested in David's brothers. He was interested in this neighbor of Saul's that was much better than Saul. This guy probably looked like Saul. He was a pretty handsome character. We get down to verse 12 and 13. Jesse sent and brought David in. David was ruddy, of a beautiful countenance, goodly to look at, or handsome. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Now, we know that even though David was a good-looking character, he was chosen because of his heart. That's the principle that comes out of the early part of the account. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came on David from that day onward. Right, so right at the outset, some of the characteristics of David. What made him a man after God's own heart? Well, God knew David's heart. Right from the outset, David was filled with the Spirit of God. That's the exact opposite of Saul. Saul was, at one time, he had God's Spirit, and God had taken away his Spirit from him because he was a fleshly man, rebellious. Verse 18 of this same chapter. Not only was David filled with the Spirit of God, we have one of the estimations of David right from the court of Saul. One of Saul's servants said, "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is cunning and plain, and a mighty, valiant man, and a man of war, prudent in matters, an agreeable person. The Lord is with him." There you have some of the other characteristics. Skillful, he's a valiant man. That says more about a person's spirit than a person's appearance. Prudent in matters, describing his mental capacity, his experience. An agreeable person, telling us what his attitude was like. This is what David was like. And by the way, in the Old Testament, David is a picture of Christ. I'm sure Christ was also in Bethlehem. Christ was also filled with the Spirit of God. Christ was also a brother among his brothers, an unlikely candidate. There are some differences, but you'll see that David really does picture Christ. Wise, agreeable, prudent, skillful, valiant. These are all characteristics that are equally true of Christ. You get down to chapter 17, verse 20. David's brothers are over fighting Philistines. They're in the valley of Aphek, I think that's the place. This is cross country, due east about 25 miles from David's house. So David is sent by his father to take some food over to his brothers. And this was a great standoff. Philistines on the north side of the valley, Jews on the south side, little tiny dry creek running through the center of the valley. About 10 miles northwest of where the Philistines were all congregated, with Goliath, their champion, is a Philistine stronghold, the name of Gath, with big walls around it. And this is on the border of, it's kind of like a no man's land. So this is a big confrontation between the enemies of Israel at this time. The Jews are led by King Saul, who has lost the Spirit of God, who has already been told that God's taken the kingdom and given it to somebody else. David's sent over, just a young guy. And we find in verse 20 that according to David's father's instruction, David rose up early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, took and went as Jesse had commanded him. That tells us a lot. Little passing statement tells us that David was not only filled with the Spirit of God, not only wise, but he was also obedient. He was cooperative. If you want to be a person after God's own heart, you have to be a cooperative person. You can't always be self-centered and resistant and I don't know what the proper term would be, but it seems to be a desirable characteristic today for men especially to be hard-nosed, independent, and hard to get along with. You know, if you want to be respected and macho today, well, you got to be tough. That means hard to get along with in many cases. Well, not according to the Bible. If you want to be a man after God's own heart, if you want to be a woman after God's own heart, you should be obedient, cooperative. That's what David was like. A little bit further, in verse 26, we find David, he first comes in contact with this huge Philistine guy that's over 9 feet tall. And he hears this guy standing up there blaspheming the God of Israel, and all the Israelite soldiers standing there quaking in their boots. David can't believe his eyes. David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So they tell him that if the king promised his daughter to the guy that would kill this fella, he kept talking to people about it. He wouldn't let it go. Verse 36, David is standing in front of Saul eventually, and he's telling what he's done. He said, "I slew both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Either David is pretty, what's the word? He's pretty full of his own importance here, or deluded with his ability, or he has great faith, one or the other. Which of the two was it? Scriptures plainly teach that he wasn't just bragging. He wasn't just one of those kind of people that has to get the limelight, but he actually believed what he said. He actually was going on experience. He had actually seen the living God at work in his life. If there's one thing that stands out about David, is that his view of God. God was not dead. God was not weak. God was real. 3 times in this chapter, David refers to the living God. That's not insignificant. God was real in David's experience. You'll never get close to God. You'll never be used by God if God is a nobody to you, if he's really not practical. one of the basic things about David's relationship with God. He had the living God concept. Verse 46. When he stood right in front of this Philistine, David said, "This day will the Lord deliver you into my hand, and I will smite you and take your head from you, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, and that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." That's pretty big talk, especially when the guy's twice your height. He has the reputation of being the eliminator. This was Chick Tracks has a track out of it. Have you seen it? I think it's called The Eliminator or The Exterminator. It's really the story of David and Goliath. You know how that back in the early days of Joshua, when Joshua and Moses had brought Israel into the land of Israel, that there were certain inhabitants of the land that were giants. They came by different names. They were called Anakim down in the area of Jerusalem and Hebron. Over on the west coast by the Mediterranean Sea, they were called Avim. Across the east side of the Jordan River, they were called Zamzumim. They went by different names, but basically they were just giants. Huge people. Just phenomenal physical characteristics. And they were original inhabitants. They were the people that already had the turf. And so David is coming in here, and he's talking to one of these original inhabitants. This guy was a fighting machine. And it made no difference to David. His God was alive. Well, after David successfully cut off this guy's head and precipitated a tremendous rout between the Philistines and the Israelites, we find David, not surprisingly, in Saul's court. I mean, Saul had to live up to his word. He had promised to give his own daughter to the person that killed this character. David killed the character in full sight of the whole army. Pretty hard for Saul to back down on a promise that he made. He tried his best, by the way. He kept adding conditions. Kind of a strange set of conditions if you read the 18th chapter, what he said to try to get David killed. Saul was quite a character. Anyway, he brings David into the court and made David his own armor bearer. And it says in verse 5 that David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now this happened like on the spot. As soon as David that day killed the Philistine, and as soon as the end of the day came when they were passing out medals, this is before they went back to Gibeah where the court was, Saul took this young guy and said, "Okay, I need people like you. You're going to be my number one man in this army." And so after that happens, they returned home, and the news quickly preceded them, and the women came out in the street and said, "Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And right there, Saul's attitude changed. And from that point on, you find that Saul becomes quite disillusioned with his character that he has brought into this court and set in his exalted position. David was wise. David was bright. He was also well known. He was, if you keep reading here, it says in verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. And verse 14, David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. What a picture of Christ. Remember when Christ was in his public ministry, he was going in and out amongst the people, and there were just multitudes of people thronged him They loved him. They loved his wisdom. He just had a rapport with the average person that the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees were lacking. He just had it. David, of course, is a perfect picture of Christ, the ultimate king of Israel. Now, as I said, this was sort of the beginning of the end, as it were, between the love relationship between Saul and David. It actually says at the beginning of chapter 18 that Saul loved David, but at the halfway through this chapter it says that he was becoming very envious and hateful and spiteful. In verse 8 we read for the first time of Saul's envy, or of his anger. It says Saul was very angry when he found out what people were saying about David. Verse 9, we have Saul's envy. And Saul watched enviously, or Saul eyed David from that day and onward. He kept his eye on him. Right? He envied him. Verse 12, we have Saul's fear. I've read that verse. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. Verse 17, we have Saul's intrigue. Saul said to David, "Behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee in marriage. Only be thou valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul said, and of course this was going through his mind, "Let not my hand be on this character, but let the hand of the Philistines be on him." In other words, he had the idea in his own mind, look, you can have my daughter all right, but you have to promise me you'll go to battle every day. You have to go up there and fight these Philistines and put yourself at risk if you want my daughter. He was simply trying to eliminate the rival. Right? No problem. Well, it was a problem because David was too good. It didn't work. Right? So we have a specific progression here. And by the way, this is part and parcel of the preparation. It shows us something about David's character. There was no problem. He was willing to abide by these conditions. Christ voluntarily went out and debated with these people. He wasn't afraid to come eyeball to eyeball with these people that the Pharisees and the scribes sent to him. A man after God's own heart is fearless. Not only did Saul become afraid and deceptive, envious, angry with David, in verse 19 he lied to him. It came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Mahathalite, in marriage. Now, there's not much that will make a guy go nuts more easily than somebody to mess around with your love life. And, men and women attach a great deal of importance to their romantic lives. And, this guy was already promised. David was already promised this woman. I don't know whether he was attracted to her. That doesn't say anything about it, but the promise was made and the promise was broken. And by the way, it tells us that as soon as the elder daughter was given away, reports came to Saul that the younger daughter, his younger daughter, loved David. She was madly in love with this hero of Israel. And he said, "Fine, we'll let this happen." And so he arranged another attempt to try to eliminate David, which was unsuccessful as well. By the way, hold your finger here and go to chapter 25 in 1 Samuel, verse 44. By the 25th chapter of 1 Samuel, David is running all through the wilderness for his life. Saul has chased him out of town. He's tried to kill him on several occasions. His number one project is to eliminate the opposition. And it says in the last chapter of the last verse of this 25th chapter, Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Galim. Not only did he give away his espoused wife, the one that he was promised, whom he never actually got to marry years before, but eventually David was allowed to marry Michal, and he gave her away, give her to somebody else. Now, not much you can do when the king takes your wife away and gives her to somebody else. especially if you try to show up to offer any resistance, you're going to be killed. This could have made David a very cynical person. What would it have done for you? Ask yourself that honestly. Somebody been messing around with your family? I think the average person would have hired an assassin, or at the very least become less than courteous and respectful. It doesn't do anything to David. David recognized that Saul was God's choice. He was the king of Israel by divine decree. He believed that Saul had a right to be the king, and that it wasn't yet God's time for Saul not to be king. David knew he was to be king, but he wasn't yet king. This teaches us a great deal about David and about patience. I'm sure David could have used any of these circumstances to say, I've had it with this. God knows that I'm supposed to be the king here. This guy obviously is living in the realm of the flesh. He's out of God's will. The Lord is with me. The Lord is not with him. And this guy is wrecking my whole life. Let's intervene here. And it would have been so easy and so natural and normal. And probably no one would have objected and called David down for doing it if David had, in patience, stood up and done something contrary to God's will. Chapter 18, verse 23. We're going to have to hurry here. Way back when he was about to be given Michael as the king's daughter and to become the son-in-law of the king, we have David's response. He said, "Seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I'm a poor man and lightly esteemed?" Seems as if David was rather, actually at heart, he was a very humble person. This attitude towards honoring the king, being respectful for God's man, is seen in that at least twice in the following years, while David was in exile in his own country, unjustly being chased around the country by King Saul, at least twice he had the perfect opportunity to go and slice this guy's throat. Literally. He was there with a knife in his hand, and Saul was sleeping at his feet in the dark. And in one case it says that God had put Saul and his soldiers into a deep sleep. And David went, and all he did was he cut a little piece off Saul's armor or his clothing. And on the second situation, he sent two of his guys in. He said, "Whatever you do, don't kill the man. Just take his spear and take a water jug that's sitting beside his head." And he backed off a couple of 100 yards and then woke everybody up in the middle of the night and said, "You idiots, God deserves to kill all. You all deserve to be killed because you've allowed the enemy to infiltrate God's anointed. And they could have killed the king without a problem. And I did that. And this proves what kind of a person I am, because I've got the king's sword, or the spear, and I've got the jug of water that was sitting at his head." And he showed it. He threw the spear back in the camp. And both times it showed Saul exactly the sin of his way and the real godly character of this man. He had no right to be chasing David around. Impatience. David could have really let it get to him. We find him in despair on more than one occasion. It says in the 23rd chapter of 1 Samuel that David and his 600 men had to go wherever they could, from place to place to place. I never actually counted it up, but there are at least 4 or 5 specific locations recorded where David he was running from one side of the border to the other side of the border. He even went into the camp of the enemy. He went to the city of Gath at least twice. The first time they recognized him. The Philistines in this city recognized him as the great warrior that had cut off Goliath's head, and the only way he survived out of that was he pretended he'd gone mad. And the king didn't want to deal with an insane idiot, so he kicked him out. Instead of killing him, he just got rid of him that way. The next time, Um, it was a little more deceptive. He went in with all his warriors. I guess the king couldn't really fight with him because he had 600 men, and he was a very powerful sheik out of the desert at this time. And they let him in because it appeared as if he was fighting against his own people, and he was in exile, and the king of Gath thought that he would be a good resource to have on his side, because he apparently wasn't in favor with his own people. So on and on we go. David inquired of the Lord many times. He was obviously in fellowship with God. On more than one occasion when he was there, he'd be hiding out, and the people next door, his own countrymen, would send messengers 30 miles north to the town of Gibeah into the court of Saul and betray David. David never retaliated. He never killed anybody like that. He always showed grace. He was about to kill one fellow by the name of Nabal. They had gone to great lengths to try to protect this man's shepherds out in the field from Philistine marauders. And this guy was so ungrateful he wouldn't even give him a loaf of bread. And that just ticked David right off, and that was, I guess, the last straw, and he was on his way. And God specially intervened to keep him from killing his countrymen. David wasn't perfect by any means. We all know that not only was David one of the greatest saints of the Old Testament, he was also one of the greatest sinners. But David was a man after God's own heart. Why? Because he was a man of patience. He was a man of godly values. He's a man that respected God's leaders. He was a man with a heart that was willing and capable of being softened by God instead of constantly hardened by circumstances. This was a man that was willing to go along with God. When he blew it, he was willing to confess it. The thing that stands out in the life of David was his heart. And I wanted to just challenge you this morning, as I was challenged in my own life in this study, that I don't think any of us have it as bad as David had it. Really. To be quite honest with you, I don't think any of us have had the injustices done to us that this man did. And yet, he went with it. He just kind of rolled with the blows, and he just kept depending on the Lord. And God blessed him for it. We all need patience. And instead of giving up when the tough times come and you think that you just can't handle it anymore, well, go think about David and ask the Lord to help you and strengthen you. He will.